Welcome back. You're listening to Jay's Analysis. Today we're going to discuss geopolitics with Andrew Korybko. Andrew is a political analyst, journalist. He's also a regular contributor to several online journals, as well as a member of the Expert Council for the Institute of Strategic Studies and the Predictions of People's Friendship University of Russia. He specializes in Russian affairs and geopolitics, specifically the U.S. strategy in Eurasia. His other areas of focus include the tactics of regime change, color revolutions, and unconventional warfare used across the globe. His book, Hybrid Wars, the Indirect Adaptive Approach to Regime Change, extensively analyzes the situations in Syria and Ukraine and claims to prove that they represent a new model of strategic warfare waged by the U.S. Andrew, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good, Jay. How are you?
I'm doing great. I really enjoyed the series that's available, and I think people should probably get your book as well, which is available at Amazon, correct?
Yes.
And what I want to talk about is this series that you did, which deals pretty much with the same thesis that's in the book. And let's talk about, first of all, what is, you speak of it as a weaponization of chaos theory, and that's interesting. Mark Hackard and myself have written some pieces for Soul of the East and pieces at my own site that deal with a similar idea of how the West in its destabilization campaigns has basically, as you said, weaponized chaos theory.
Yeah, like the way that I look at it is this. I see it as though from the American perspective, whereas in the past the United States was at least try to make it seem like it was trying to build and create the so-called New World Order. Mm-hmm. Now in the face of rising Russia, rising China, and basically in general this idea to move towards multipolarity, be it in the economic, financial, or geopolitical spheres, the Wolfowitz doctrine has kicked in. And just to remind all of our listeners, that was first promulgated in the early 1990s as the thesis that all the U.S. really has to do to remain number one is to keep the main powers divided and prevent them from coming together. Basically, all the U.S. really has to do is play the role of spoiler by disrupting integration processes. And when the U.S. started losing control over its view of integration, its post-Cold War unipolar view of integration in Eurasia, because it just wasn't able to keep China or Russia down, then it just decided to figure out, hey, look, all we really have to do is create these selected destabilizations. Don't even really have to control them. If they affect allies, so be it. The main idea is to weaponize the processes to keep Russia and China away from one another, to also disrupt Iran, and to create problems so the Eurasian great powers, they're always so busy putting out the flames that they can't build anything. This is the general theory, at least.
You make an interesting connection between that and what you call the reverse Brzezinski trap. Could you explain that? Does this relate to 1979?
Yes, it does. This is something that I first started writing about for Oriental Review. The website is orientalreview.org. And the way I look at it is this. We have Zbigniew Brzezinski as one of the most prominent strategists of the modern era. And his original claim to fame was in tricking the Soviet Union into entering Afghanistan and then sucking it into this bloody Islamic terrorist quagmire. Now, in the 1990s, then, he came out with a little bit of a different idea. He came out with the Grand Chessboard, where he sought to, if you will, build this unipolar world. So that's really how it became famous, if you ask me, among many people, is because of that book and the influence that the Grand Chessboard had. But nowadays, just as I was talking about how the U.S. has lost control of these integration processes it wanted to build, now he's gone back to his roots, which I've decided to provocatively call the reverse Brzezinski, in creating these traps, these geopolitical traps for Russia, but also for Iran and China. And I can just lay out the three most common traps I see right now for Russia are in Russia's so-called near abroad. In this case, Donbass, in the Caucasus, Nagorno-Karabakh, and in Central Asia, Fergana Valley. These are three powder kegs that could explode, and if they do, or when they do, we can say, it might actually prompt a conventional Russian intervention. In this case, it wouldn't be special forces or just an air campaign. I mean, actual troops on the ground in uniform that can try to repeat this Afghan trap scenario.
Interesting. Now, let's maybe get into the specifics, because you talk about this as an asymmetrical form of warfare that you're talking about with the hybrid wars, and you actually propose that your model is a good means by which you can, in a way, forecast where the next hotspot conflict will be. And as I read through your pieces, I thought the logic was pretty tight. It shows pretty consistently what's most likely in these scenarios. So if you could briefly explain how this kind of meshes with the color revolution scheme and the NGOs tie into it, and the social media, hashtag revolution type stuff, how this all ties together in this form of asymmetrical warfare with the terrorism perhaps at times.
Okay, well, the first thing I'd like to say is the reason that it's asymmetrical is because in symmetrical warfare, in this case, U.S. and Russia facing off against one another, it would actually be a stalemate because Russia has enough nuclear weapons to stop the United States and vice versa. Hence why unconventional, or in this case, asymmetrical means need to be employed. Now, when I speak about hybrid warfare, I'm not just speaking about information manipulation and so on and so forth, as the U.S. tries to make it seem like Russia and others are doing. I specifically mean the phased transition of a failed color revolution into an unconventional or terrorist insurgent war for a couple main reasons. I say that this model is predicated on controlling, disrupting, or influencing multipolar transnational connective infrastructure projects. In the case of Ukraine, this was to stop Eurasian integration and basically offset one of the main paths for China's new Silk Road. In the case of Syria, which I also study in my book and I reference quite often, this was to stop the friendship pipeline between Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Now, the means of doing this are to orchestrate identity conflict in targeted transit states. And the identity conflict, I say, can take one of 6 different forms. Generally, these are ethnic conflicts, religious, historical, socioeconomic, conflicts that deal with physical geographic identity. In this case, in some countries, people in the mountains have a different sense of identity than those in the plains, and political administrative identity. For example, some states or federal entities within a country, they feel like they're separate from their unified state. How NGOs play into this is NGOs, their main role is twofold. One, it is to precondition the targeted populations into accepting a sense of identity separateness, be it being politically opposed to the government or going even deeper and saying, look, we need to have our own separate state, federal unit, whatever it is to agitate anti-government hostility. Then you mentioned hashtag revolutions. This kind of goes into the operational standpoint in terms of actually activating the on-the-ground anti-government movement into a color revolution. And color revolutions, I say, are inspired by something that I term the event. The event is usually something that is used to organize these different disparate members that are being cultivated by the NGOs into some loosely integrated critical mass. Now, the event could either be a disputed election, it could be a
sniper event.
Yeah, absolutely, that as well. You can also have just a controversial trade agreement, or that was or was not signed, like in Ukraine. Or recently, I see something that I term Color Revolution 1.5, and that is the use of civil society movements to just manufacture a crisis. Like in Armenia, we saw the so-called Electric Yerevan. They were upset about electricity prices spiking, then it turned into an anti-government movement. Or in Malaysia, a corruption scandal against the prime minister for reportedly receiving, I think it was hundreds of millions, maybe even billions, into a fund that he controls for some type of national investment or whatever. But why this is important now, Jay, now we get into the realm of the NSA. The NSA, with all the surveillance, everything they're sucking off, vacuuming up, the NSA, they can, let's just say, they can selectively release wiretaps, like what happened with Brazil, happening with the Republic of Macedonia, to spark these events, to give a new impetus. Leaks. Yes, 100%. That's what we're seeing now.
Oh, yeah, great point. I'm glad you brought that in. I didn't even include that in my notes, but I think the targeted leak scenario is very important because it does play precisely into the phases of what you're talking about. And you kind of mentioned like a like a preconditioning phase where the NGOs kind of marinate the populace for a while, and then does that kind of transition into the Gene Sharp marketed, branded color revolution?
Yes, it definitely does. Actually, Gene Sharp's books, they serve as the ideological and organizational template for how to achieve these things. I mean, he wrote one book, From Dictatorship to Democracy. Well, in reality, it should be From Democracy to Dictatorship, because that's essentially what it leads to in these cases. He also wrote There Are Realistic Alternatives, which included 198 so-called creative solutions to nonviolent resistance. Now, what this did is, this first, From Dictatorship to Democracy, this inspires people into a certain way to frame their situation. And then the organizational methods are in There Are Realistic Alternatives. So in terms of how to get these networks created, how to rally the population, how to be so-called like secret with what you're doing. And then the NGOs, though, what they do is they're the middleman facilitators between the on-the-ground activists and the foreign governments that are behind them. And now many times the way that NGOs, foreign affiliated NGOs are adapting is they're no longer just, let's just say, bringing in an American team to run operations, let's just say in Armenia. They're using Armenians that are either being trained in country by foreign staff or being sent outside of the country, to say to Ukraine or Serbia, to be trained there. Then they go back. So basically, it's you have a foreign soul, but you have a local face. So average people, let's just say in Armenia, to run with the example, or Republic of Macedonia is another perfect example. They think, hey, this is a fellow citizen passing out fires trying to get me to protest. They don't realize the paycheck's being cut in Washington.
Exactly. That's funny you mentioned that. I have been lecturing through the entirety of Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, which is kind of the Anglo-American apologetic for the last century. Of course, it's a bit dated, published in 1966, but he's projecting what to expect towards the latter third of the book. And there's a section where at the end of World War II and into the Cold War section, he mentions the very thing you're talking about, that the majority of future conflicts in satellite states would actually be at the behest of the power blocks, the bipolar world, so to speak. And so this is interesting because he almost predicts the sort of war on terror that would emerge out of the Cold War period. And what's interesting is that now it's almost like we've transitioned into what you talk about as the postmodern imperium of the U.S., where it's not just the utilization of terror networks, but also all of the mass media. And so we talked about the NGOs, but you also mentioned in one of the articles that the mass media participates as well, working in tandem, or at least the Western, sort of CNN, and then its affiliates and satellite type networks will run constant propaganda to advance the agenda of what the color revolution is trying to achieve. But you mentioned as well sanctions, and so does this kind of come at this phase when they're really wanting to spark the so-called revolution or whatever, so that the populace tends to kind of coagulate into the identity politics that you mentioned, and then they have a convenient scapegoat to blame the problems on, even though the sanctions might actually be coming from the U.S.?
Yeah, actually, sanctions are very, very important because they deal with structural preconditioning. Because you have two types of preconditioning. The first type I spoke about is social in terms of identities and attitudes. The second one is structural in terms of unbalancing the state. Because whenever you have a fully functioning state, you typically don't have these sorts of identity problems, or they're not as easily manipulated. Now, if the state is under targeted sanctions and they're having difficulty importing medicine, some other things, see, these sanctions, they're never designed to affect the ruling party or the government directly. even though the U.S. says that, and then the running joke is, well, hey, the U.S. is always wrong. They never target those big bad guys. They always hurt the regular people. Well, see, it's supposed to do that. Right. It's supposed to target the regular citizens to help formulate the anti-government attitudes and make the people more susceptible towards being manipulated into protests and whatnot. I mean, like what we're seeing in Venezuela, for example. Now, there are many different reasons why that's occurring. I mean, there is admittedly some high degree of mismanagement going on there, but we still see these same technologies at play. And as we spoke about, or as you mentioned with the mass media, they're instrumental in this because they help shape the whole idea. They set the framework for how everyone else responds to it. Because the moment CNN starts coming up with a narrative, then usually a lot of these other media networks, their local affiliates and their partners and so on and so forth, they start to copy that angle. So even in terms, if we look at the language they use, everything is identical. Everything is taken from that first meta-narrative, and that narrative is what's important. Because if we go back to chaos theory, one of the main principles is that the initial starting conditions determine or have a very strong determining effect on what happens afterwards. So if we start to change the narrative right away, and that starts multiplying out of control into this whole idea of a dictatorship facing, a popular uprising, then that really has a very strong effect on people's attitudes. And actually, when you mention Cold War era works, I'd like to introduce you and our listeners to something very fascinating I was reading a couple of months back. I'm actually trying to incorporate it more into my research. It's a book from the 1960s, I believe. It's called Propaganda: The Formation of Men's Attitudes. I found it online. I mean, you could probably find it however, but it's by a guy. His name's in French. I'm probably going to butcher it. I believe it's Jacques Ellul.
Last name.
Yeah, excellent book. And I think that everything that's happening nowadays, I mean, that guy really nailed it. He nailed it like half a century ago, and that's what's happening now.
Yeah, when I was writing my book on Hollywood, I went to some of Ellul's sections where he talked about, in fact, he makes the amazing statement that the cinema as a form of mass media, the movies, Hollywood, is actually the most powerful form of propaganda that exists. Bernays, prior to him, said the same thing as well. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. And, that Hollywood will tie into this, too. They'll run movies that, particularly have a Pentagon bent. We know that there's a liaison office between the Pentagon and Hollywood, as well as the CIA and Hollywood. And so that's how we have a lot of the propaganda crafted in the movies that I believe kind of fill in the gaps, because most people that maybe are watching mainstream news, especially in the U.S., they don't really know what's going on in these different regions. They might hear little nuggets and bits and pieces. And so then what Hollywood does is fill in the gaps of the story so that people get this fictionalized version of what's happening in some foreign conflict. But you're absolutely right to tie it to Jacques Ellul. But so you mentioned as a couple recent examples of this technology of revolution, which is a good way to describe it, Ukraine and Syria. Now, the Syria conflict begins in 2011. They have a color revolution that begins it there. And we also had this connected to the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. So you want to talk a little bit about why Syria and Ukraine are perfect examples of this?
Yeah, I think they're perfect because they really are the archetype for everything that came afterwards. I mean, if we look at Syria, as you mentioned, there's the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is a transnational, shadowy group of Islamist revolutionaries. That's how they fashion themselves, as trying to impose a Salafist government on secular societies. And if we look at this then, it's kind of very similar to this Gulen network that we see being exposed and dismantled in Turkey. And it just showed, just like the Soros Foundation, for example. I mean, these are all the same. They just have different faces, and they use some slightly different tactics, but towards the same goal. Now in Syria is the Syrian Arab Republic. It is a very, very strictly secular society. And then this might sound crazy to some listeners. They're saying, well, hey, there's this so-called Islamic State there. How is it secular? Well, these ideas were imported from abroad. However, they do use some local elements of the population. Because one thing, I mean, it's even difficult for me to understand, because thank God I'm not in the situation directly, but when you're undergoing such intense warfare, I mean, some people, they start to become susceptible to the craziest ideas. And especially if you're getting paid. I mean, now we know that the United States and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, they were paying for some of the salaries for these so-called rebels. I mean, that just goes to show you can't be a revolutionary, a real revolutionary as the media wants people to think, if you're on the payroll of a foreign government. If they're giving you a gun and they're telling you to shoot, I mean, that makes you a mercenary. That doesn't make you a rebel.
Right.
But just like you said, Hollywood, they romanticize these things.
Right.
And they present the ideas with movies, because a movie, it's so much easier to imprint an idea on someone when they're watching a movie, because they're in a friendly atmosphere, they're with the girlfriend, drinking a beer, eating popcorn on a Saturday night, and you can just tell them whatever, and they're going to believe it.
Right.
But to go back to Ukraine, though, if we're going to talk about that, that was very, very similar. I mean, except I think that one of the reasons why Ukraine succeeded, whereas Syria didn't succeed with the color revolution and transitioned into the unconventional war using some of these non-state actors like the Muslim Brotherhood at the forefront as the vanguard, is because Ukraine, I mean, this was a society much more open to these NGOs for a long time. They let in everything. And not only that, during the Cold War period, many members of the Ukrainian diaspora were being cultivated in the United States and Canada particularly with the Ukrainian classes and Ukrainian churches and all this stuff, and they were taught to hate Russians. Yeah. So and they had this very nationalist understanding of their history, nationalist in terms of fascist World War II understanding. Mm-hmm. So once 1991 came along, these people, they started coming to Ukraine, they started joining the NGOs, and they had about 20 years to prepare for this. Whereas in Syria, I don't have necessarily a date of when this stuff started. It had started happening, I would say, in the early 2000s with President Bashar Assad kind of loosening some of these previous national security restrictions in society that were taken advantage of by some of the groups. But even then, it was nowhere near anything like what was happening in Ukraine. So once they found an event, they manufactured an event. Basically, it was blackmail. Either you sign this European Union Association Agreement, which is not an association agreement, it is a slavery agreement to open up the economy entirely to the EU and get nothing back and be forced to make political concessions nonstop until you turn into a Bosnia or a so-called Kosovo, or you're going to have domestic unrest like what they previously had with their so-called Orange Revolution. Now, the president, Yanukovych, he ended up refusing the agreement at first, and that was the trigger for the regime change to go into play.
Well, what's interesting about Ukraine, I mentioned Quigley earlier, there's a section where he discusses Hitler's tactics for that region, and Hitler was fighting on two fronts with the West and Russia, and one of the insights that he has is Quigley, is that he said that Hitler realized he had to try to break Kiev and Ukraine out of Russian influence. So it's almost like the strategy of Brzezinski is mirrored in the Hitler tactic. And Hitler actually tried to ban Russian. He tried to ban the Russians in that region from speaking. I don't know what they were supposed to speak, German or something, I guess. But yeah, so that's been a long tactic for that region, and that echoes the Brzezinski statement that you paraphrased, that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an imperial influence or whatever. This, in the situation with Syria, I wanted to mention before we moved on, I don't know if you've seen any of the work that Patrick's done at 21st Century Wire. Patrick Henderson.
Oh yeah, he does fantastic work.
Yeah, there was a great piece that Vanessa Beeley did there dealing with the white helmets, and I thought that was such a phenomenal example of what you're talking about, of these these NGO type groups that in this case are actually linked with terrorists that are shooting propaganda films, and they're some of these guys are actual terrorists and operating under this cover of something akin to like Doctors Without Borders, which is oftentimes a kind of cover that's used for foreign governments to engage in different operations in other countries that you've mentioned. It was actually created by Bilderberg. So would you say that we're kind of seeing a repeat maybe of the World War II era and then into the Cold War era? You call it a new Cold War, and it's what the media's donned this new phase in relationship to the Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing a repeat of that. I mean, one thing that I've said before is, there's this cliche that if you don't learn history, then history is bound to repeat itself. I take it a step further. I say those that do know history sometimes intentionally try to repeat it because they see some tactics that work there. They see some strategies that work there. And I'm glad that you brought up Vanessa Beeley's work on the white helmets because they're the perfect example of how an NGO can transition from supporting so-called peaceful color revolutions to outright terrorist support, if not active participation. Right. And we see the white helmets, they are really the first globally known instance, the globally popular instance of terrorists just putting on a white helmet, shaving their beard, or not necessarily shaving their beard, sometimes just trimming the beard, and just continuing with their tactics. Now, what's interesting about they just change costumes, and they make a big deal about these hospitals and so on and so forth. And see, this goes back to the preconditioning of the global audience, because usually when a Westerner hears hospital, they think maybe a 7-story building with a helipad at the top and some emergencies and ambulances coming back and forth and very sanitary environment. Now, what the white helmets mean by hospital is literally just a building with a guy on a table, and a doctor isn't a doctor like me or you think they are, which is a real doctor. This is just someone with a knife ready to cut the person open or take out a bullet. That is their definition of a hospital and a doctor. So if you have terrorists that are under fire from the Syrian Arab army and they're taking shelter, and let's just say a bombed out apartment block, and they throw one of the terrorists on a table, guy pulls out a knife, and then the Russian Air Force bombs it, according to the white helmets, that's bombing a hospital. But it's not. It's not a hospital like we would think about it, but that's how they define it. They use that definition, and they weaponize the definition, because I also say that we're in a generation of what I've started to term fifth generational warfare, basically meaning the weaponizing that which was previously unweaponizable. To give you examples, a protest. Turn a protest into a mechanism for overthrowing a government. You using hospitals, if you will, for example, this very arbitrary definition of a hospital as an information warfare hammer to hit your enemies with. Right. Or also using an NGO, like supposedly helping, what the media says, helping Syrians into a terrorist front. I mean, this is really what's happening. Or even we can even say the weaponization of large-scale immigration flows, like Kelly M. Greenhill has spoken about in her 2010 work, Weapons of Mass Migration. Same thing.
Yeah, and that's directly out of the Western academic establishment, showing that migration of population and demographics can be weaponized. And really what we're seeing here is part of that chaos theory that everything can potentially be, not everything, but you know what I'm saying, everything relevant can be weaponized and turned into some means by which you can direct the propaganda or direct the social engineering and direct mass opinion. And that's I wrote an article about NGOs and how the model that you're talking about in other countries is actually the same domestically here for the U.S. with these Soros-funded groups. So you'll see the same strategies with the radical feminists and with the radical, say, Black Lives Matter groups. And I'm not saying that there aren't legitimate, qualms with regard to the functioning of the police. That's true. Yeah, but you also can't just assume that, anything that these same entities, you have to look at where they get their money is what I'm trying to say. And I think that's oftentimes a big key. So we've seen that same thing with groups like FemIn and how the State Department and Soros, and they kind of lurk in the background of these radical movements, Pussy Riot and their actions in Russia. It tends to be the same tactic is what I'm trying to say. So I think your insights here for foreign policy are also applicable to the technology of social engineering in the U.S., because I think we're like the most propagandized people on the planet here in the U.S.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the way that I see what's happened in the U.S. right now is the Democratic Party has weaponized identity politics, and they're using it for very particular means. I mean, they're using it not just to divide and rule, that is definitely part of it, but they're also using it to create a perception that, I believe this perception is failing, that, the country's falling apart because of Donald Trump's supposed racism. Now, I don't think that's the case at all, but that's how they're marketing it. They're marketing it with Black Lives Matter. And as you said, there are some very legitimate grievances, and there are definitely some documented abuses that have taken place, and the perpetrators 100% need to be brought to justice. But also, like you also mentioned, you have to follow the money And you see the Soros Foundation, and now with the Soros leaks, they have openly been supporting the so-called Black Lives Matter, which, this is my personal opinion, the whole narrative of Black Lives Matter, I believe it's based on a lot of false premises. This so-called hands up, don't shoot, that never, ever happened. That has been proven from court documents to never have happened. It was made up. It's just like what typically occurs with standard color revolution technologies, and has made me think that George Soros, who is basically a non-governmental affiliate of the American government in many ways, was just testing out these technologies in far-flung places away from the American homeland, perfecting them, then importing them into the United States for use to help, in this case, if we're going to use color revolution terms, to help the ruling party or the regime, as Gene Sharp would call it. That's essentially what's happening here.
Absolutely, I think you're spot on. Now, what's interesting too is that you get this dialectic where you also have to ramp up the patriotism. I'm not talking about the U.S. situation, but I'm saying I thought it was interesting that you pointed out that what am I trying to say? The mirrored version of what we're talking about with the U.S. happens in these other countries, and they'll play on legitimate grievances, right? So you mentioned the case of Venezuela, or there's other countries where there might have been legitimate corruption in the government, but it's crucial for these networks to exploit those and then turn them into something beyond what they actually are, and radicalize then the opinion of the people that they're trying to manipulate. And I thought it was great that you pointed out that this was not really successful in Syria because of a patriotic civil population there. Exactly. But it did seem to be a little more successful in the Ukraine. Is that correct?
Yeah. Absolutely, because one of my angles of research nowadays has been trying to discover counter-color revolution practices and ideas, and what I've noticed is patriotism is the number one counterweight to color revolution ideas, because a patriotic population is different than a nationalist population. I'd like to quote President Putin, who himself had quoted, I believe it was a Soviet-era writer. He said this quote a couple months ago, published an article on Katehon about this, and he said that patriotism is love for your homeland, whereas nationalism it's like hate for the other. And essentially, we do have a lot of patriotism in Syria because it's a multi-millennial old civilization, and the people recognize and embrace their plurality and diversity in all ways, whereas Ukraine, in all senses of the meaning, is a fake state, with the name itself, Ukraine, essentially meaning border or frontier, in this case between Poland and Russia during the Middle Imperial period. And Ukrainians, even though there is this Ukrainian identity, this state of Ukraine never fully embraced its cosmopolitan nature and was always pushing through a nationalist agenda at different times and with different intensities. And that ended up isolating and ostracizing a lot of the population that does not identify as ethnic Ukrainians, but identify as Russians living in Ukraine, which they didn't even want to live there. Just after 1991, the borders were redrawn. They were thrown into a new country, not of their making at all. So this state was already on very fragile ground to begin with.
Right.
The government did not do anything positive to rectify the situation. If anything, they kept pushing this Ukrainian nationalism, which ostracized the Russian-speaking population, also other minorities. In Western Ukraine, there's a small Polish minority, there's some Romanians, there's some Hungarians. Now, granted, these populations are a lot smaller than the Russians, but still, basically the populations were being isolated. They were meant to feel like they didn't belong. Then you have this orgy of nationalism, which is very easily exploited by George Soros and the color revolution groups, turned into Pravi sector, which is already being trained in Poland. Some members are being trained in Canada, so on and so forth. And then it just created this revival of Nazi-era fascism in Ukraine that we also see being transplanted also in Croatia, for example, against Serbs nowadays. I mean, we have this fascist-era idea of Greater Albania. I mean, we go back to history, like you mentioned earlier, and we see that, they learn from history. They learn so well that they're trying to repeat it over and over and over again.
Yeah, that's a great point, too. And I've tried to make this argument many times against certain members of the right, be it the alt-right or the new right in Europe, is that while a lot of the grievances and ideas might be correct, if you fall into this trap of thinking that you can change modern geopolitical alignments merely by like 1800s era nationalism. It's not going to work. And so many of these nationalist movements can also be technologies, exactly like you're saying. It just depends on, as Quigley pointed out, which power block might be in the background. And generally speaking, unfortunately, for most of this chaos, it's, of course, Washington's policy that's in the background. And it's shadow characters like Khodorkovsky or now Soros. Now, one of the reasons this is all a big deal that you point out that's crucial when you mention the transnational connective projects, these conflicts are crucial because you've got, as you point out, the friendship pipeline, and that would be the intention of Syria, Iran, and Iraq providing energy to Europe, and then of course a different situation going on with Ukraine, but also with energy. And that's why it's crucial for the West to spark these revolutions in these hotspots and try to integrate Ukraine into what you call shadow NATO membership. And that's also why they had to do this same thing with Syria. And that's why ISIL pops up in the Middle East, and presumably why the far-right fascist private sector types would pop up then in Ukraine, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Because if we look at the world in general and we just zoom out and look at global politics from a structural perspective, right now everything's in a state of flux because China is now strong enough and assertive enough to create a completely different economic system. Now, it is still using a lot of neoliberal ideas, but it's changing it by taking away the predominance of the United States through the creation of these new Silk Roads in a program that they officially term the One Belt, One Road, which are these transnational multipolar connective infrastructure projects meant to tie all the other countries together in a network of complex interdependence. Now, what that translates to is if everyone's trading together, they're less likely to start fighting and turning against one another because they all have a stake. They're all stakeholders in this new system. And the Chinese goods have become more efficient, yet they're also cheaper. And it's a lot more attractive to use China as a partner than the United States if you're looking at it from a pragmatic win-win type of way. Now, these projects, they can be the Eurasian land bridge, which are the high-speed rail networks envisioned to connect Western Europe with Eastern China by means of Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Or they can be maritime, such as what China's trying to do with Eastern Africa. We also have different smaller scale regional projects such as the Balkan Silk Road Railway from the Greek port of Piraeus to Budapest, potentially all the way up to St. Petersburg, ASEAN Silk Road, high-speed rail from southern Chinese province of Yunnan. The capital is Kunming, down to Singapore, and so on and so forth. In this case, if you map them out, you see that there are, of course, they go through transit states, and these states have their identity vulnerabilities, their hybrid war vulnerabilities, which makes them a lot easier to manipulate using NGOs on the ground that can also transition into active insurgents or insurgent terrorist supporters like we see with the White Helmets. White Helmets are just the first. There will be many more after them. Everything that's happening now is being perfected and for use elsewhere.
And that's why you say the Balkans is the new region, right, for these kinds of destabilizations, right?
Yes, 100%, because if you look at the Balkans, they already have very firm identities, okay? And the identities are also fixed to a specific geographic space. So basically, we can say there are lines drawn in the sand. But within these lines, within these borders, you have governments. Some governments are not that efficient. So therefore, now you have these targeted leaks that can be used. You have NGOs that can be very attractive. You have some people that don't have a lot of willpower to even continue supporting the government because they feel like, hey, we've been robbed for so long. Like what happened with Serbia, for example. Serbia is a perfect example of a country which already has a pro-American government, but there are a lot of people that don't support that government, but they're being misled by, interestingly enough, pro-American opposition groups supported by these American NGOs to deflect away from legitimate resistance of the government, legitimate peaceful resistance, to basically co-opt. They're co-opting legitimate grievances so that they can never be used for tangible change. But because of the Balkans, because of where they're located, there are two main projects going on in there. One is what I call the Balkan Stream pipeline. It's my name for Turkish Stream because you're never going to see any Balkan country say that they have a Turkish project on their soil. It's just not going to happen, okay? But this project will go through Greece, Republic of Macedonia, Serbia, Hungary. Complementary to that and running parallel for the most part is this high-speed rail project that China is building between Budapest and Piraeus. So now we see Russian-Chinese strategic partnership is coming together in the Balkans, using that as the back door to Europe to basically break down the U.S.'s unipolar resistance and have this peaceful opening of multipolarity, having an economic corridor with an energy corridor and so on and so forth that will go right into the heart of Europe. Because of that, because it goes through such a complex region, though, a region that is very easily manipulated because of the wars that had recently happened there and pre-existing identity conflicts that can be easily manipulated, like the situation of trying to engineer a greater Albania out of Macedonia, for example. They're vulnerable, and that's why we're seeing an uptick in instability now in the Balkans.
I wanted to ask you about that next because there's a great book by Mark Curtis called Secret Affairs where he kind of chronicles the long history of the Western establishment's support and cultivation of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then how this kind of moves into the periods of Al-Qaeda and now ISIS, and particularly through like British intelligence networks and so forth. And there's a really good chapter on the Balkan conflict, on Serbia and the Kosovo Liberation Army. And you mentioned this 1994 conflict in your article. And Khodorkovsky, and I wanted to ask you, is this kind of an older version of what we see now with Soros and kind of the perfecting of this technique? Is that what was going on in the 90s with these conflicts?
Yeah, that's what was happening. In fact, the entire Balkans were being used as the laboratory for testing out all these theories in an active environment. I mean, that was the ultimate battle space for this asymmetrical warfare. If we go back into history, we see that actually there were some color revolution technologies being experimented with in the former Yugoslavia right before it turned into open warfare. That was actually preceded by the so-called Spring of Nations in 1989, I believe it was, which was actually a color revolution. Those were actually color revolutions that were happening, with the one in Romania turning very, very violent. So we see that this turned from color revolutions, one that turned violent in Romania, to failed color revolutions that immediately moved into open warfare in Yugoslavia, which created the Yugoslav wars. And as it relates to Kosovo and Albanians and everything that's happening there, that was, if you will, that was a leftover conflict that was meant to be activated at a later date, as it was. Just like we see with the 1991 Gulf War. The reason the United States didn't finish the job, as everyone says, is they wanted to save that for a later time. Same principle held true for what happened with Albanians in this dissolution of Yugoslavia was, well, okay, they could have activated that Kosovo card anytime. They just chose to hold on to it and work with it later.
Interesting, because what we see is this same pattern of having your networks kind of already established there. And I believe, if I'm looking back at the book, it was there was in the 90s there was Operation Clover, which is the U.S. intelligence sponsored plan of millions of dollars involved in British operatives basically arming the Muslim radicals in that region. And I think you pointed out that Putin basically is who eventually brought some stability to this region. And the main point I'm getting at here is that it just shows the insanity of what the Western policies are. It necessitates that they have chaos, and the West is constantly demonizing Putin and Russia, but that's what brings stability. And so I think we can see I know that generally speaking, morals are kind of absent from large-scale geopolitics, but the irony here is that despite all the propagandizing of morals in geopolitics, it's Putin who has pretty consistently brought stability to these regions, as well as kind of booting out some of these oligarchs. You've been listening to the first part of my interview with Andrew Korybko, editor of Russia Today and writer for Katehon think tank. Andrew's book, Hybrid Wars, can be obtained by going to Amazon and searching for Andrew Korybko. I want to thank you for listening, and if you'd like to hear the full interview, the next 20 or 30 minutes or so, go to Jay's Analysis, subscribe for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. Thank you for listening.